I am Games, and this is a rant. So I'm doing a solo rant today, and I don't really expect this to be getting me any favors, but I just wanted to talk about my recent experience I've been bitching about on Twitter with Dark Souls 1, and how I was really hoping, upon the completion of Bloodborne, which I actually came around to pretty strongly, and we're probably doing a podcast and maybe a whole video about Bloodborne, just because my experience with the game is really interesting. I was really hoping that having fun with Neo, and then having fun with Bloodborne, enough that I completed it, bought the DLC, beat that, and came to really appreciate that game for what it was and what it had to offer. I really hoped that I could go back to Dark Souls 1, which I first tried back in 2013, not having any context for Souls-like games, that maybe, now that I had a ton of Neo and the entirety of Bloodborne under my belt, I could go back into Dark Souls 1 and finally get it. I could finally understand just what everyone fucking sees in this game. And I still hate it. And it really bothers me. Because this is a game that everybody I know that plays video games loves to death. And to be fair, with the context of Bloodborne, and with the context of Neo, and knowing how the game is supposed to be played, I got farther, did better, and appreciate it more than I did before, where I thought it was an outright failure. Now, coming from Bloodborne, which granted, FromSoft has years of extra experience and more knowledge on crafting these games, it might not be a fair comparison, but people still say that Dark Souls 1 is their favorite Soulsborne game over something like Bloodborne, and I just don't understand that. I can't grasp it, because everything that I loved about Bloodborne, that kept me going, the visceral combat, the great animation, the tactility, the catharsis of hitting something with a weapon, that, in my opinion, is what kept me going through the entirety of Bloodborne, was the fact that every time I did actually dodge and then hit something, it felt like a big come. It was just the sensation. Like that's the whole thing. And I've said this on stream on I Am Games with both Neo and Bloodborne, that if you don't have that visceral nature of the moment-to-moment gameplay in a Soulsborne game, me personally, I don't understand how anybody continues to play, because that's the rewarding part, right? There's the true big come of beating the bosses and beating the hard enemies. But the moment-to-moment gameplay really comes down to positioning, resource management with stamina. But for me personally, the big draw is those cathartic hits that make each little baby step forward, each time you chip away at a boss's life, or each time you do damage to an enemy, that really makes the moment-to-moment gameplay actually worth playing. And Dark Souls 1 has none of that. None of it at all. And it just leaves the entire experience so much more, well, pardon the pun, hollow to me than Bloodborne. And just, it doesn't bring enough to the table to make me want to continue playing it. Right, with Bloodborne, when I got stuck on, Father Gascoigne the first time I played it way back in the day, I still pushed past Father Gascoigne, even when I wasn't a fan of Bloodborne, because, the sensation of hitting him was great, and I just wanted to get in there and beat his fucking ass, because just that encounter felt good to play. Granted, I didn't understand what I was doing, because I didn't understand how Souls games worked at the time, but the reason I got as far as I did was because of that. The first time I played Dark Souls 1, I don't even think I got to the Taurus Beast. I don't even think I got that far, just because it felt so shitty. And coming back to it now, I'm on the Gargoyles right now, and I'll get to those in a second. But it's just every hit just feels like a wet fart. It feels so bad. And I get it that it's a 3 or 4 year older game, but there's just nothing there. There's no combos to your weapons. I'm started as a bandit. I'm using the bandit axe. It just has one hit that repeats over and over again. The stamina cost for everything is way higher. I think rolling uses 4 or 5 times more stamina in Dark Souls 1 than it does in Bloodborne. That makes sense to me, I guess, now that I think about it, just because in Bloodborne, you don't have blocking. So your dodging is your only ways of avoiding damage, and so you need to be able to use it more reliably. But stamina costs in general in Dark Souls seem much higher. I can only swing an axe a few times, whereas the Hunter in Bloodborne gave you a lot more options. And maybe that's the problem right now. I have to first I had to unlearn like Devil May Cry kind of combat to get into Bloodborne. Maybe now I have to unlearn Bloodborne to get into Dark Souls. But that's the whole thing. It's not the mechanics of Dark Souls combat that really bothers me. I like it. That's my favorite part. In fact, one of my big things that I really came to appreciate playing through Bloodborne was the positioning and the resource management and the push and pull to the combat, combined with this really visceral sensation of when you pulled it off, was great. I really liked that. But with that visceral sensation missing, it just falls flat on its face for me. There's just no payoff. You know, when I'm fighting like skeletons or like hollows in the beginning, and I'm getting a couple hits in, normally in Bloodborne, when you're fighting like the beginning enemies, like the people of Yharnam and like the werewolves and shit, those hits feel great and you feel like you're doing some real damage. And this, your axe just kind of like bouncing off people, you know, and like making really weak impact effects, really weak sounds, really poor feedback. And the fact that there's really no depth to the combat in terms of like the actual mechanics, there's no combinations, there's just a regular hit and a charge hit. It's just so bare bones. It's so minimal. And just, there's no catharsis in killing things. The catharsis in Dark Souls, so far at least, is just the fact that you beat a challenge. And I guess to me that's not enough. And I say that, but I still want to beat those fucking gargoyles. So let's get to the gargoyles. The reason why I think the gargoyle fight in particular is really pissing me off, and kind of is the point where I'm just like, put down Dark Souls, I'm like, I don't know if I want to keep going with this, is that it seems like the worst possible way to start off Dark Souls' boss encounters, knowing the mechanics that the game has. And let me explain what I mean by that. Bloodborne, Dark Souls, Soulsborne games, Neo, they really are based around positioning and resource management. Taking out the catharsis, which I like so much from Bloodborne and Neo. In terms of raw mechanics, it's those two aspects. It's how you're positioned relative to your opponent and managing your stamina in order to continue to be effective. You're trying to chain a flurry of disparate attacks and motions and stuff into one seamless performance while maintaining this very limited amount of resources in your stamina. So I get that. And while I still don't like it as much as something like a Devil May Cry, where it's all about showmanship, I can appreciate the system for what it is, and especially in the context of something like Bloodborne, where it makes a lot of sense. But this system works at its best in the boss battles of these games, when it's you versus one other guy. And so it's just, I'm focused on trying to maneuver around this big bad that is way overpowered compared to me, has like hundreds of times more HP, and can deal 10 to 50 times more damage depending on the attack, right? So like, you're at a disadvantage from the beginning. So you're making up for this huge gap in raw numbers with skill. The positioning, the movement, and all that stuff. And the mechanics in the Soulsborne games are beautiful for one-on-one combat. They break down when you have to fight multiple guys. Bloodborne is really good about this with trick weapons, right? Because there are tons of mobs in Bloodborne. And at least for me, using the Hunter Axe, it has a secondary form that has huge sweeps that's great for taking out 2 or 3 guys at a time if you're getting swarmed. At least at this point with the Bandit Axe in Dark Souls 1, none of that shit. Again, because there's only 2 moves, a light horizontal attack and a heavy vertical strike. Again, very similar to how it's in Bloodborne, but so much more basic. And that means whenever there's multiple guys that you're fighting, the clunkiness of the system becomes incredibly apparent because you don't really have any good way of dealing with multiple guys. Now, some people might say, that's the point. It's hard. Get good. But what I'm saying is that Bloodborne handled this great. Now, granted, Bloodborne has the benefit of hindsight, but I'm playing it now. So I have to judge it now. And maybe that's unfair. Maybe that's terribly unfair of me. But when I go and fight these gargoyles and I'm fighting one, it feels great. Everything clicks. I'm on this rooftop arena and it's me versus one of these guys. He's got fire attacks. He has huge sweeping arcs. I'm going to be able to choose when to dodge versus when to block. And like in this scenario, when it's me versus one big guy and it's this huge uphill battle, the mechanics are super limited, right? Like I have 2 attacks, a dodge, and a block, but it comes down to the strategy, where I'm positioned, when I choose to block, when I choose to dodge, how I'm going to manage my stamina. And that makes for an interesting encounter. But then, halfway through the battle, the second fucking guy comes in, and it's just the worst way to showcase your boss battles by starting you right off the bat with a 2v1 boss fight. Because it just demonstrates to new players right from the beginning, yeah, all those times you had problems dealing with mobs coming up to this guy, including like a fucking room full of like 15 guys leading up to the boss fight for the Gargoyles that you have to run through and try not to get hit every time and hope you don't, and you don't waste 2 or 3 Estises just on the trip back to the boss again, always leaving you in a suboptimal position. But it's just like, now you're in the first real boss, if you skip the Taurus, because I guess he's an optional boss, but you're in the first actual boss battle with a cutscene, and now you have 2 guys, and all the weaknesses and all the shortcomings of this system become apparent. And not only that, they have huge flame AoE attacks. And it's just like, really? Like, this is something I would expect. Like, Bloodborne throws stuff like this at you late game. You know, when you fight the Shadow of Yharnam, and you got 3 fucking dudes on you at once, and one's a mage with homing fire and all that kind of shit. And like, at that point, you've got a lot of time to learn the fucking systems. You have a lot of time to understand your weapon. You've upgraded a bunch of times. You know how the game works, right? This is pretty deep into the game. And so when it throws a boss at you with 3 guys, you're like, oh, fuck, this is a step up from what I've been doing before. The very first real boss of Dark Souls 1 puts you in a disadvantageous situation ×2, and it showcases all the weaknesses of the combat system because it hasn't, in this game, been refined to really handle multiple guys at once. You're putting the weakest aspect of your game front and center on the first big boss fight. And the boss fights are the meats and potatoes of this series, right? Because these are the big challenges that you have to overcome. And that's hard. And I understand it's hard, and it's supposed to be hard. The difficulty isn't even the big thing. It's the fact that the mechanics are so threadbare, and they don't seem to have been completely figured out to work in a situation like this, compared to something like Bloodborne, which has a few more years of experience and really makes the same kind of scenario shine, combined with the fact that the very basis of the gameplay itself, the moment-to-moment hits in combat, lacks any sense of weight or catharsis that any good action game should have. You put all these together, and just for me, it's like, fuck, dude, why am I even trying? Why am I even putting up with this? Because, like, I keep going back to Bloodborne. I'm probably going to do another fucking playthrough at some point, because the moment-to-moment gameplay feels great. You know? When I started my New Game Plus, just because it immediately puts you back in there once you finish the final boss, I just ran out and, like, I was wondering how strong the first werewolf's going to be. And that first hit, when it connected, felt great. It still felt great, even after like 40, 50 hours, however long it took me to fucking finish this game. Dark Souls doesn't have any of that. Dark Souls 1 has none of that catharsis. And so I have to ask myself, why am I going to put myself through 30, 40, 50 hours of this game when the moment-to-moment is not rewarding? The only reward from this game, I feel, at least from my perspective, is the idea of, like, I did it. I overcame this big challenge. And that's great, but if I'm not having any fun doing it, you know, and I don't feel that video games are an accomplishment, because, like, I measure my self-worth through other means. Games are just fun for me, and I'm not having fun, and the sense of accomplishment really doesn't mean dick to me in the long term. Like, I've beat Bloodborne and all the DLC, I don't feel accomplished. I really just feel like I've wasted a week when I should have been working on making my game, you know? It was a fun distraction. So, like Dark Souls, again, I've said it from the very beginning, anyone who likes Dark Souls, good on you, dude. Like, it's a great game. One of my favorite things about Bloodborne and Dark Souls is the way that they've crafted these crazy interconnected worlds, and how you can feel like you're going miles in the other direction, and then you take an elevator and you're right back at the beginning of the game. You're like, how the fuck did they do that? It feels so crazy when you have these moments. Like when I'm in the fucking fucking undead church or whatever, and then you take the elevator down and you're back at the Firelink Shrine. It's like, what the fuck? That was like 3 hours ago, and now I'm right back here. It's fucking cool. That's great. I love that. I don't remember what my point was that I went off on this. This is like a tangent. But moral of the story, nothing in Dark Souls 1 is really clicking for me. I've played it for a couple hours now, and here's the kicker. After all that, I'm probably still going to keep fucking trying, because I paid $40 for it, and now I just want to fucking beat it because I'm mad that I'm losing. And I guess that's probably the drive that drives everyone to play these games. But what I'm saying, I guess at the end of the day, is that I was really hoping that I would boot up Dark Souls 1, and with all the Bloodborne under my belt, I would finally get it. I'd be able to bust into the PCP lounge chat, like, hey Nate, hey Digi, hey Hippo, I'm one of you now. I get it. I understand. I've seen the light. Praise the sun. Dark Souls 1 for the win. And if I'm going to get there, I'm not there yet. I've been standing and walking and ranting for how long now? My leg is fucking killing me. I gotta stop. Shit. Thanks for listening. This was way longer than I thought it would be. I hope some of that made sense. Again, love Dark Souls if you want. I will continue to keep trying, and hopefully my opinion will change, because at the end of the day, I want to be wrong, right? I was wrong about Bloodborne, and people might say in response to this video, Lamau, I remember you shitting on Bloodborne hard during the Neo playthroughs and stuff. But I'm happy to be wrong here. Do you want to know why? Because I have a new game that I love. I was able to take something from the don't like pile and put it into the like pile. That's a net win for me. That means there's more things in the world I like. I can go read the Bloodborne comic now and be stoked about it. I can listen to Bloodborne 2 rumors and be cautiously optimistic because the game really ends on such a great point. I don't think it needs a sequel, but at the same time, another fucking Bloodborne game would be great. So I want to be wrong. I want to come back to you guys in 2 weeks with another rant like this. I was wrong. Dark Souls 1 is fucking sick. I get it now. But at this point, it's missing everything that I loved about Bloodborne that made me turn around. So, outlook not good. Rant over.